as you can see, joined by a good friend of mine, and he's here so we could talk some ugly American sports together. And something I was really looking forward to bringing someone like him, like you, onto the show because, just so you guys are aware, my friend Brandon here actually has professional experience working with one of the biggest sports radio stations here in Dallas Fort Worth. It's actually a guy I think Bill Parcells will never forget very much.
Oh, he's probably done forgot me, but I got a bit of 5 minutes out of that one.
Yeah, maybe I'll tell you guys about that story one day. But the main purpose here is that we decided to get together and this is something I wanted to talk about for some time now, and this is about the most perfect time to do so because for those not aware, we are right at the apex of the college football postseason. The semifinals of the college football playoff were just done about 2 nights ago. I will give them credit that at least they got something right in allowing Cincinnati into the playoff. Couldn't get the job done against Alabama, unfortunately, and whether or not it's gonna be help or hurt future non-Power 5 schools' abilities to get into this thing, so long as it stays at 4 teams, which is what, more or less about the subject matter that we're pretty much going to be talking about here. We'll have to wait and see on that. But the whole issue is that I think a lot of people began to realize this year especially, that especially with all the questions of would Cincinnati be able to get in? Would a UT San Antonio go undefeated and get screwed over like Central Florida did a few years back? It just goes to show that even though they still technically have a playoff, but albeit one that isn't actually organized by the NCAA, this thing still has a lot of problems. And I have said it's not going to be completely solved until they allow every single conference at the 1A level, and yes, I call it the 1A level still. None of that FCS, FBS bullcrap. I'm not into that in any way, shape, or form. Until they can get all the conferences that are at the 1A level, which would mean expanding the playoff, in my view, to at least 16 teams, the college football playoff is still always going to be a joke. And because of that, it's one of the effects of this is again something that's just gotten on my gourd all the time, and we had another round this year of major conference reshuffling and conference relocation. And of course, like I said, it all started with your favorite school, the University of Texas, along with their cohorts up north in Oklahoma, suddenly deciding that they didn't want to be part of the Big 12 Conference anymore. And now they are on their way to the Southeast Conference as early as, 2023, I think it's going to be?
The plan was 2025, but these things always seem to find a way to expedite it with whatever exit fees, entry fees, conference payoffs, whatever. Most likely it's going to be sooner rather than the 2025 timeline set forth.
We'll wait and see on that. But anyway, the main thing is, once that decision came down, everyone was already predicting doom and the death knell for the Big 12 Conference, but it seems like the Big 12 managed to salvage themselves by proceeding to pick off the University of Houston, which is one team I thought should have been in the Big 12 a long time ago, University of Cincinnati, along with Brigham Young and the aforementioned Central Florida. They're all jumping now to the Big 12 within, I guess, that same relative time span. Should point out 3 of those schools were from the American Athletic Conference. So the AAC, in response to that, they're plucking off 6 teams, most of them from Conference USA, would be the University of North Texas, UT San Antonio, Rice, Alabama Birmingham, Charlotte, and Florida Atlantic, which has now got everyone thinking that basically Conference USA is done for. Haven't heard anything about whether or not they found any schools to recover from that.
They picked up Sam Houston State out of the whack. Jackson State's being called up from, to use your term, double A. And then Liberty, who's been playing as a football independent, I think it was in either the Big South or Atlantic Sun. I want to say Big South. will be moving over. And then what kind of makes more sense is New Mexico State will be paired up with UTEP now, since UTEP was way an outlier before. And so they picked up those 4 schools. But for me, one, I don't really like calling this a realignment like it has been last time, where there was huge amount of shuffling top to bottom. This seems to be more of just a few schools in a small geographic print. Like the Pac-12 is not going to be affected. The Big East, I think they added.
It's not most of the Power 5 schools that are being affected by this for the most part. This has been it did come as a result of 2 schools that were already in technically a Power 5 conference jumping to a bigger Power 5 conference, as the SEC is basically trying to make themselves the USA's equivalent of the Europe Super League and whatnot.
Well, and
you might not even know what that is.
I do, but they're pretty overrated, top to bottom. They have some great schools, and I'm not going to say that. But outside of football, let's look at this realignment. Big 12 was already a pretty dang good basketball school.
As long as Kansas is there,
well,
for sure.
Not necessarily, because like Oklahoma and Texas hasn't done much lately. But they put in 7 teams out of 10 into the NCAA tournament. You think Cincinnati's not going to add to that? Think BYU's not going to add to that?
Very
Houston's
possible.
a top 25 team now.
And that's a very good point you bring up. These realignments, they definitely will have impacts on many of the other sports in here.
No.
But let's not kid ourselves.
This
is
all
being
about
done
football.
because of football. Which brings us to basically how, in my view, how all this realignment is affecting our school. For those of you who are not aware, both Brandon and I both attended the University of Texas at Arlington. And here's all you need to know. The last year that UT Arlington played intercollegiate football, Back to the Future was in theaters. There was one WrestleMania that had ever been held, and the original Nintendo Entertainment System had just hit stores. Yes, UT Arlington has not played intercollegiate football since 1985, and it's always whether or not what it's going to take for them to bring it back. That's kind of going into what I've been saying. Meanwhile, like I said, they haven't had maybe a ton of success. We're great at wheelchair basketball. That much I could say. Baseball, they've made the NCAA tournament a few times, especially even now 5 times now. Yeah, okay. And of course, the biggest, the revenue generating sports, men's basketball. They were building up something. That's of course something else I might not get to. But the main thing you need to know is, for many years, we played in a theater in men's basketball.
Yeah, and I know this is not the path we go to, but it kind of fits within the theme of realignment because UTA is going to be hit. And, you can't look at a whole program's portfolio as the entirety of the program, because to me, you can't look at UTA's success until 2012.
Yeah.
Because literally you cannot underestimate an auditorium as your basketball.
Which is what I'm about to get to, because it was in 2012 that our school finally opened up an actual full-time sports and special events center. However, this is what kind of just always kind of got me, that while I was really looking forward to this place opening. And yes, it's a huge step up from Texas Hall and where they used to play in. Outside of the actual players and coaches, ever since that place opened, the athletics department was making a number of decisions I wasn't really in agreement with. And the number one thing is that almost immediately after this new building opened, UTA announced they were leaving the Southland Conference. Now, one thing I forgot to point out at the beginning here. When UTA dropped football in '85, that was about 3 years after they and the entire Southland Conference were basically booted down to the 1AA level. And you can't tell me that being in that position was a huge reason why they chose to drop the program. I think what basically came down to was the school decided it wasn't worth spending about $1 million a year on a 1AA program.
Well, it's a little less than that. It comes down, like everything else, money. Mm-hmm. In that the fan support wasn't there. And I struggle with this in so many ways because the fan support was there a decade and a half prior, but you're talking about a couple of things that happened within the basketball program the last few. We seem to be our biggest enemy. We shoot ourselves. We were the conference leader in attendance in football rather. And then all of a sudden we move off campus, we move up to the upper level, we don't give them any more money, we start losing, and what do you think is going to happen? It's entirely predictable, and yet here we are, to this day, still talking, why isn't there fan support? Well, what have you done? Like, we've made one basketball tournament, we haven't had a real venue for a full decade, we fired the winningest coach in basketball history just because he didn't make the conference tournament in a one-bid league, but he had 3 20-win seasons in a row, including the record of 27, I think it was. And so,
they were this close
yes.
to at least playing in Madison Square Garden in
Yep.
the NIT Final Four. That would have been a pretty big damn deal.
Yeah, the only postseason wins in basketball history that matter. I think we had a CIT win. And say what it's for worth for schools that are trying to build something like we were back then. A CIT is a great tournament, but nobody's going to look at it as a prestigious event.
But let's get back to what Iska was saying. Like I said, they made the announcement almost immediately after this new building opened in 2012 that UTA was leaving the Southland Conference. They played in the Western Athletic Conference for one season until that thing completely fell apart. Of course, I'll talk more about that probably in a bit. So they eventually ended up in the Sun Belt Conference. And like I said, it actually took a while to restock recruiting and everything, but we were actually winning in the Sun Belt Conference. Won the Sun Belt regular season conference championship in basketball in 2017.
Were it not for Georgia State, I think there would have been more than one NCAA tournament appearance.
But at any rate, but the main purpose here is that now, currently, basically for one reason or another, the South Sun Belt Conference, at least maybe they didn't officially kick out UTA, but it does seem like the Sun Belt basically told UTA and Arkansas Little Rock, who are now, I believe, the only two schools in the conference to not have football, but basically they're not interested in having them around anymore.
Yeah, Commissioner Keith Gill sent out a letter basically saying, we've talked about this before. Basically, if y'all want to stay in the conference, we're going to withhold all college football playoff money, which is ironic because they get very little to begin with. Like, we're talking a few $100,000 at most, which for the college football playoff of a mid-level conference like the Sun Belt is, they're getting millions out of that thing. So, it's just football is driving the bus in the Sun Belt, and that's kind of frustrating because we are a top-tier athletic program.
And so basically what's going on now is I think by the end of 2023, UTA is leaving the Sun Belt Conference, and we're kind of in limbo right now. Now,
That's not official yet. There's been feelers out. Freedom of Information requests have shown that the Missouri Valley Conference and UTA have been in talks for over a year now. Well, Little Rock's already gone to the Ohio Valley. Now, the rumor is, and take that for what it's worth, is that if Missouri Valley doesn't accept UTA, they're looking at the WAC, ironically enough.
Yeah, I was just about to get to that. They were talking about the either the Missouri Valley or the WAC. Now, me personally, I would actually prefer the WAC, just from looking at this school. Now, I looked up these schools in preparation for this. Now, you said Sam Houston's gone, actually, on there. But even still, if you look at these, that would still leave, I believe, 5 schools in the state of Texas that UTA could play against. Now, on the flip side, we look at the Missouri Valley.
Right.
Not only would UTA, it's not just that UTA wouldn't be the only school in the state of Texas. They'd be playing this in a conference where 4 schools are in Illinois, 3 are in Indiana, 2 are in Iowa. And what really gets me about that is just the amount of travel that would put on not just the men's basketball program, but all of the sports programs in there. And it just comes back to this one thing that I keep asking myself. Why was UTA doing this, put themselves in this position by leaving the Southland Conference in the first place? And this is what I really came to believe is the fact that even though they don't play it, I've always begun to feel it has been about football. My belief has been there's been a number of people in the UTA athletic offices that want to bring back football, but they will not settle for anything other than bringing back 1A football. And that's why I think I've said this, if they had stayed in the Southland, the school would have football back by now. but they left there because they were looking. The best way term I can think of is their eyeballs were bigger than their stomachs. They were hoping that moving eventually out to a 1A conference would give them the ability to have 1A football back 1 year. It's nearly been a decade later. It still hasn't happened. And now basically the conference themselves told them they're tired of waiting for it. And now they're kind of stuck.
Well, see, I don't know. I don't reflect that opinion at all. In that, going to the WAC, they weren't the only school invited that was a non-football playing institution. Seattle was there, and I want to say there was one other California school at the time, but I could be wrong about that. I was thinking there was 3 out of the 10 that didn't play football, and then once that fell through, and the big name programs, Utah State's. San Jose State, things like that. When they fell off to the Mountain West, we were left with what? Pretty much the same thing as the Southland, where you have Texas A&M Corpus Christi. They're not a peer school, not in athletics, not in academics. They're just not a peer school, and that's what the Southland was turning into. And you see it now with the call up of Texas A&M Commerce, like a regional school versus one that's got a national ranking. I understand the idea of going to the WAC. I was less upset about that because we had San Antonio coming with us. We had now Texas State coming with us. So we had the regional rivalries. And then I was happy when we went to the Sun Belt because Texas State, again, went with us. But we were renewing conference rivalries with Arkansas State and the 2 Louisiana schools in Monroe and the Raging Cajuns. The Missouri Valley, what do we have? Nothing. Like we've played, our closest one will be Missouri State. We've played them 5 times in basketball in 50 plus years.
Exactly. That's the biggest thing. The only thing that just keeps me thinking about my belief that all of their own conference shuffling here at UTA was based solely on football is, I've always said this from the beginning, and I had some arguments with certain individuals, let's say, that were in the administration of the athletic offices at the time, but they're not there anymore. But there was that. I really looked at the conferences they were going to, like even the Sun Belt Conference, the significantly of the WAC, and I said, do you really think UTA or anyone else in that school is ever going to get an at-large bid coming out of those conferences?
The WAC, yes.
Maybe, I'm saying maybe you can look at, maybe there is a somewhat difference in tier structure between the Southland and the Sun Belt and the WAC and whatnot, but I think ultimately they're all in the same boat in that they're only going to get one bid into the NCAA tournament, and which means that ultimately those conference tournament games in March are the only ones that matter above all else. So I don't know how much moving out of the Southland really benefited them that much. In fact, I was willing to say, if they had stayed in the Southland, they could have dominated the Southland, been making multiple NCAA tournaments like Stephen F. Austin ended up doing once we and San Antonio and Texas State basically left that conference to them. At the very least, UTA versus Stephen F. would have been the biggest rivalry in all the Southland Conference, in my view.
Yeah, and Stephen F. is kind of an interesting case study as far as that analogy goes. But, talking with some coaches, they want to play in a better conference to recruit to. And so it's hard to say, had everything stayed the same? Probably. But would have Kevin Hervey gone to UTA? Would an Eric Neal sign with UTA playing in a regional Southland school rather than, in the case of the Sun Belt, one that spans a quarter of the country? And I don't have that answer. It's all speculation, and probably where you stand depends on where you sit. But the point is for me, looking at the Southland, one coach built that up, another coach kept the momentum going. But at that level, one bad hire, as we see here at UTA, can or maybe in our case one bad fire, but can derail a program. So I don't begrudge the searching for a better home from that perspective, because Utah State is going to be better than Incarnate Word. Even San Jose, as bad as they are across the whole spectrum of their athletic program, is still going to be better than a Houston Baptist. And that's the problem, is that the Southland was in survival mode, taking any and all comers. Back when we were students, Rio Grande Valley, they were called something different back in the day, but they were wanting to be in the conference, and they were rejected. Corpus Christi was rejected until there was nothing left. And that's kind of, I think, why the Southland we kind of outgrew.
Perhaps, but the fact that one way or another it ended up where now they're going to end up in a place where, like I said, they've got no natural regional rivalries to build up any type of fan interest, and that's especially a tough thing. Like I said, in a place like this where you're competing, you gotta remember the DFW area. You're competing with 3 other Division I schools for attention and recruiting, all of which I think at least one of which is in a Power 5 conference, and even they have struggled to recruit top prospects out of the DFW area when this is a very good ground for high school basketball talent in the entire nation.
Yeah, but again, if you're a top talent and you're being asked to go to TC or Kansas, that's not a hard choice.
Fair enough.
You know?
Even a program like Michigan
Sure,
and whatnot.
absolutely.
That stuff. Because how many members of the Fab Five came out of the North Texas area?
Yeah.
There were at least 2 of them, if my recollection is correct. But the main thing is, like I said, that is probably the crux of why all of this conference realignment just kind of irks me, is that it is ripping apart what I thought was the basis of what made college athletics so endearing to a lot of people, was that it was based all on regional, traditional, long-time rivalries, and now everything is so spread out. I mean, that's basically the number one reason TCU wanted to go to the Big 12. Ultimately, it wasn't for the chance of getting, okay, maybe the possibility of getting help them get into, at first, a BCS bowl game, and then later maybe a CFP spot was. But what they wanted more than anything else was to go back to playing other Texas schools in conference.
Yeah,
I think that was a lot had to say about it.
Maybe, but they willingly went to the Mountain West Conference.
Well,
so
yeah,
they were on an island there.
It was a situation where they had to keep moving back and forth into any conference to try to get enough prestige to build up to get into the Big 12 conference. But that was ultimately their goal. Because remember, TCU was always felt irked that they got passed up in favor of Baylor for the Big 12 berth, and the people always say it was only because Ann Richards, who was governor of Texas at the time, pulled some favors to get her school into the Big 12.
And that may be. I can't say for that one. But I guarantee you, if the Pac-12 had offered TCU before Big 12 had, I think TCU would have taken it, simply based on that.
But it only comes down to one belief I've had more than anything else. If Division 1A college football had an actual full playoff system, like even what they have in 1AA, where every conference, within reason, I know there's been some issues where some conferences in 1AA don't get an automatic berth because they don't have enough schools and whatnot.
I think that's changed when they expanded out the playoffs. I think the SWAC
very well
willingly doesn't participate, so they can do their own HBU
or the Ivy
bowl
League.
Game. And the Ivy League is against it for academic purposes, but like even the non-scholarship Pioneer League now has a automatic berth for a conference championship.
But the thing is that if they had something like that in 1AA football, we would not be hearing any of this type of these relocations wouldn't be happening.
Yeah,
I don't think,
agree.
because as long as if you knew that at least your conference is guaranteed at least one berth, then this constant gamesmanship almost of trying to work yourself into a better position. And again, that's just why I kept wondering then why did UTA want to move into another conference when no matter where they go, they'll always have a chance, and they're never going to get into a conference where they're going to have more than one chance. Well, I think it always was because they want 1A football back in one thing or another, which is another thing that just boggles my mind as well as to why so many 1AA schools want to move into 1A. You don't get a fair shot at a national championship. Most of those schools lose money in 1AA football. If you're not an absolute power program like a Texas or an Alabama or a Notre Dame, you're almost likely going to be losing money every year. Most schools lose money traveling to bowl games if they get into.
Yeah, 100%. But there's more money to be had at the 1A level, again, to use your term, than there is at the lower level, and just like even a guaranteed game is now going for $1.5 million, $2 million, $2.5 million. But for the FCS schools, you're looking at a few $100,000, maybe $500,000. And so just based on that alone, you get more college football playoff money dispersed to you at that level than the lower level. But for me, all right, I'll take this year's example. Alabama didn't win their division. How in the heck can you tell me they deserve to be competing for a national title against 3 other select schools when they couldn't have been the top in their 6?
Well, they have to have won the divisions because they made it into the.
No, I'm sorry. Georgia lost their conference.
They won their division. Georgia lost the SEC title.
What I meant to say was like with the Auburn example, and then there was one time not long ago where Alabama was playing for national title even though they didn't win their
I'm pretty sure
my point was more like you can't be the best in your conference. And if you're going to dilute the pool the way you've diluted it, how can you honestly make a claim? When, remember, we can't have a playoff because the regular season means every game means something. And if we do get rid of the bowl system, then the regular season becomes meaningless like college basketball. I mean, really?
They're now sending teams with 500 records into bowl games.
Yeah,
yet we can't have even an 8-team.
7.
We can't even have an 8-team college football playoff. Say nothing about a 6-team. And like it always comes back to what I've said, and just the whole thing of saying it makes the regular season less valuable. No, it doesn't. Not in college football because so many of those conferences, it does come down to that. Their season where you win your conference, you get into the playoff. So now for all those other schools, they have a legitimate shot. So many other schools now have something to play for. If anything, it makes it even more. Now, there are some issues in college basketball because of how many schools get in and whatnot, and that's a whole other subject for a whole other time. But it basically always comes down to this. Maybe we might be on the cusp of at least finally expanding the college football playoff. We'll have to just wait and see if they're finally going to give into that. But I've always said this. The reason, despite no matter what anybody says, the reason they have refused up to this point to expand the college football playoff isn't because they think no one outside the top 4 or is capable of winning a national championship. It's because they're afraid they can. Probably. They are scared. Trust me, those SEC schools, they are scared that a day may come that a Sunbelt football school could knock off an SEC program in a one-and-done college football playoff game.
Well, it's happening in the regular season already. I mean, Florida lost to another FCS school this year. I want to say it was Florida, but at least it was one again FCS school, and then they happen. Like the idea that on any given Sunday, right? And that one of the phrases?
Or any given Saturday.
Well, in this case, yeah. But the phrase is any given Sunday. That, like, that's the problem. And if that starts happening, they have to share revenue. I mean, again, it's a money thing. That's why I say
money
it's always
and pride. Money and pride, I'll say that.
Well, no, because the Bowls still own the system. Like, that is, they don't have a dog in that fight, but they see 100,000 seat stadium in Alabama, 30,000 seat stadium at Appalachian State. Well, gee, who do I want come? You know what I mean? This fan base is still rabid here in the Mountaineers, but this one's going to be, the casual fans who are going to travel a little bit. Like I know some Alabama folks who go to our kids' school district and they travel quite often. I work with somebody in Alabama, but he's at least from Alabama, so he has that connection. He went to school there. But my point is that they have that ability to draw more money towards them if Alabama's in it than if Appalachian State is in it. A Georgia Southern, a North Texas, a Utah State. Like we can.
It is kind of. That there is some kind of concern about there, but then again, it does kind of go to the concern of someone like me, of people who are trying to consider that it's never been about money in college sports, and it just goes to show you that maybe that isn't the case.
No, it's always been about money.
And why? And just when you look at just why that type of stubbornness is continuing to endure, it's just one example of probably why someone like myself, and I don't think I'm alone in this, is probably getting alienated and turned off more and more to college sports, and getting turned on more to something like European soccer, and which has an organization that may not be perfect in of itself, but almost has something like almost what college sports could be.
Sure.
More or not, in that every season is like you win your national league, and that gets you into the European tournament. It has everything something worth playing for. And I think when you look at how much viewership in the States is growing towards stuff like the Premier League, it's definitely a thing that I think college, to put it as nicely as possible, college sports is going to get left behind, I think, quicker than some people think, especially once some of the old grad alum boosters that are pretty much keeping the game afloat right now, once they all start dying out, you're not going to be easy to get a lot of students who right now are more concerned about paying off their student loans than being all sis boom ba about their football team. You're not going to have those the next generation of good boosters to keep your football churning in millions all the time.
And I haven't thought about it from that angle, but I can tell you that there is going to be a well that's going to be drying up, which is why I'm still surprised at the linchpin that started all of this conference shuffling in this latest round. But cord cutters are affecting college sports tremendously right now because without that revenue, these conference deals that were so cush, even for like the American Athletic back in the day, are not going to be so cush.
That's another big concern I've always talked about as well, is just how sports in general it's basically been the one thing that cable and satellite TV companies are leaning onto to try to remain any type of relevance. But that is a bubble that is cast to burst one of these days.